Hello. It's been a rough couple weeks. I just got out of a friend's wake. It was for his son, for his little 8-year-old, Marcus. A bright spirit. He was awaiting a double lung transplant, and he didn't make it. It's been tough, especially having a young child myself. The reason I bring it up is because of the focus we had throughout this conference with Dr. Gabor Mat. Hug your goddamn kids while you still got them. Never take a moment for granted. We spend so much time wasting it away, worrying about what other people think. So when we do that, it sucks away from the moments that we need to be cherishing with the ones we really care about. So much energy comes from a simple hug. Hugging your goddamn kids. We started a campaign called Hug Your Kids. And we grayed out the T in thug, so it was really thug your kids. Reason being, so many people questioned it. And it's pretty self-explanatory if you just read one of Gabor's books. Peer orientation versus an umbilical connection with your parents. If kids are raising other kids and parents are not raising their kids, oftentimes they end up in trouble. They end up delinquents. That's the reason behind it. It's an entendre. And I believe so much in it because I know the lack of hugs in my life growing up. I went to the school of hard knocks. I had to learn the hard way. I didn't have a lovey-dovey family growing up. So I've seen to it that I am producing a lovey-dovey family. So when I have friends who are young in their own right, losing their children, I don't just look at them and sympathize. I look at all these parents of these kids that I coach in basketball, and they're so disconnected from their children. Lack of accountability. They're allowing tablets and video games to raise their damn kids. What does that say about our future? Where we're headed? And it brings me to the point where I throw a dang conference like this, where I spend a year booking Gabor Mat to cross my fingers and hope that 500 people show up, which they did. 496 to be exact. 100 others bought tickets and are going to be receiving the digital version of the talks. We put so much effort into this. And I have to thank everyone who was involved, from my social media team, from my production team, to my staff day of, to the doctors themselves. Dr. Joe Tafur, Dr. Dennis McKenna, Dr. Gabor Mat, our host with the most, hostess with the mostest, Giselle Ugarte from Media Bridge. Great things can happen when we come together. And I hope that's a philosophy that people will take with them. You know, I grew up and I ended up a loner. I was a kid who had a lot of friends, but I was alone. And it had me acting out, acting a fool, ending up in trouble, whether it be with the principal, with the law, with my coaches, with my mom. It came down to the fact I was not holding myself accountable. And now, as a professional adult, I receive these awards and we put on these successful Lincoln drinks and other events. And there's all this praise, but people don't understand I don't do it for you. I do it to prove myself that I am worthy. I hold myself accountable. I don't do it for accolades. The pat on the back that matters is the one I give myself. The self-love is what I cherish because I've worked so hard to get to that point where I can unconditionally and genuinely say that I love myself. And it's not easy. It takes so much work to love the man in the mirror because my ego wants to go against the grain and he wants to say, you're not good enough. You'll never be good enough. You've still got more to do. And don't get me wrong. My ego challenges me on a daily basis. And I wake up and I show up to the dance with my size 12s on and I get the job done. I love challenging myself. And Gabor, he hit me with a very, very much needed therapy session after the event. He came with me to my house to drop off some extra books. And we went and got him some food. He had to hop in a car and head to the airport early the next morning. So we got to spend some quality time together. And Gabor, doing like Gabor does, he just hits you with questions that make you question your intent in life and the trajectory you're headed. And he hit it right on the head, man. Nick, more time for you. The others don't matter. It's you. If you don't take care of yourself, you're always going to sell yourself and others short. Because I am here for a reason. I'm going to continue bringing people together, but it's so important for me to take time for myself. So, over the last couple weeks, I have done just that. Family, 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 and myself. And a panel in between. We had Lincoln Drink last night, our 7th sold out one in a row. Last night was our 1-year anniversary. And now we've already came to the conclusion, all right, we're going to take a break. We're going to do this quarterly. We're not going to do it bi-monthly anymore. And that's much needed. So we can hone it in. Self-love. So with that being said, I hope you all enjoy the show. This is one I worked very hard to accomplish. But first, some quick business. This episode is brought to you by Cato CBD, your official CBD provider, located right here in Minnesota. Go to catocbd.com. Use code word astronaut at checkout. Save yourself some money. This episode is also brought to you by Rochester Lapidary Jewelers, your original custom jeweler. Go to rochesterlapidaryjewelers.com or stop in the store and design your original custom piece of jewelry. I love you all and enjoy the show.
I'm gonna be high as a fucking man.
And now, the stationary astronaut.
To the show. I don't know if we can categorize this as the first ever Stationary Astronaut live podcast, but here we are with world leader, world-renowned speaker, the living legend, multi-time author, best-selling author.
Keep talking.
I know, we're going to butter him up a little. He loves it when I do this.
You're doing well. It's a good beginning.
Gabor, we rhyme it with Gabor Labrador, so whenever you encounter this man, don't say Gabor. It's Gabor, rhyming with Labrador. So it's Gabor Maté. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I want to kick it off with a little 21st century conversation, Gabor.
Yeah.
You walk around the streets, you converse with people. What do you think when you see so many people looking down at their cell phones?
Well, desperation. It's like anything but to be with the present moment, anything but to be with yourself, anything but to be with your own mind. R.D. Laing, the British psychiatrist, said once that people are afraid of three things. They're afraid of other people, death, and their own minds. And in the 21st century, we're terrified of our minds because the minds today carry so much pain. So this is an attempt to escape.
Escapism.
It's escapism. It's also a desperation to connect because we lack the actual, authentic, real connection. We seek it through this technology.
What do you think brings that on?
What is it that brings it on? It's the nature of the society. You have a whole society that's based on the ideology that people are individualistic, aggressive, competitive, selfish, which is the opposite really of how it is in terms of real human nature. But when you set up a society along those principles, you get a lot of people with a lot of pain. Precisely because the way society is, it hurts how people really are. So the fundamental trauma is the loss of connection to ourselves, which this particular culture invites and then exploits.
If you were to implement a blueprint to heal the trauma in elected officials, how would you go about that?
Well, I would say to them, Donald, for example, what do you really need? You need to be loved, right? Just because 1 million people shout your name doesn't mean that you're loved. Just because you get to put a title of POTUS in front of your name doesn't mean that you really respect yourself. Just because you get to push nuclear buttons or threaten them, it doesn't make you strong. So where are you going to find the love? Where are you going to find the self-respect? Where you're going to find the real strength is on the inside. And you need to deal with that because you deserve it, and it's in you, but you were cut off from it a long time ago because of your childhood trauma. So do you want to deal with that, or do you want to get the substitute, bogus version of it? Not just for him, but for most of us.
With us being creatures of habit, where do we distinguish between addiction and being a creature of habit?
Well, habits are simply behaviors or patterns that we follow repeatedly. Like you have the habit of eating breakfast. There's nothing addictive about eating breakfast. It's a habit. It works. So an addiction is a habit that you do for temporary relief or pleasure, and therefore you crave, but you suffer negative consequences as a result of, and you can't give it up. So habit may be good or bad. What makes an addiction is the craving, the temporary relief, and the long-term negative consequence, and the inability to give it up. So that's what an addiction is. So habit may be an addiction or it may not be, if it meets those criteria.
Whether people believe it or not, you're actually a human being, you're not an alien.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Whether people believe it or not, you're actually a human being, you're not an alien. And you've had your own addictions.
Yeah.
What were those? I know you had a CD collection addiction.
Well, my own particular addictions are rather respectable. I mean, I worked in Vancouver with severely addicted people that are hooked on heroin and cocaine and crystal meth and alcohol and every drug grown or manufactured. My addictions were respectable in the sense that people would even admire you for it. So I had a shopping addiction, in my case for classical music, and people say, how can you be addicted to classical music? Well, you can't be. I wasn't addicted to classical music, I was addicted to shopping for it. which is not the same thing. And that meant leaving other responsibilities, my work and my home responsibilities, to go and seek out new versions of music I wanted. It would spending money thoughtlessly and impulsively, thousands of dollars at a time sometimes. And it also meant the typical behaviors of the addict, which is based on shame, which is lying about it and cheating and so on. And with the negative consequences on my family, on my self-esteem, on my marriage relationship. So people always say, how can you compare yourself to your heroin-addicted clients? Well, I'm not comparing myself. I was a lot luckier than they were. I hadn't suffered the way they had, and I didn't have negative consequences the way they did. And I wasn't outside the law like they were. The differences are obvious. The similarities are already interesting. And my other addiction has been to work, which is, when you're a doctor and if you're a workaholic, what do you get? You get admiration and respect and, oh, isn't he wonderful? But that wonderful doctor is ignoring his own emotional needs, his spiritual needs. Maybe he's ignoring his own family. Maybe he's depressed and alienated when he's not working because he's only getting fulfillment when he's doing that one thing. So again, it's got the hallmarks of addiction, but it can look very respectable. So this society is full of these respectable addictions. And then we demean and dismiss and ostracize the marginal people who are drug addicted. What we should really be looking at is how we're all similar, not how they are different from the rest of us.
Is it safe to say then that your wife runs the Amazon Prime account?
I'm sorry, it's not hearing. There was a noise behind us.
Is it safe to say that your wife runs the Amazon Prime account then?
Well, it's interesting, my marriage relationship, because it was typically codependent relationship. In other words, instead of accepting the fact that my wife was living with an addict for all the admirable ways I might have shown up in the world, but that was going on. She tried to change me. And that's what a codependent does, is they're dependent on the addict to be different so they can be happy. And that codependency created a lot of suffering in our marriage and in our family. And at some point she stopped being a codependent. She says, you deal with it. I can't be with this anymore. You deal with it or you don't deal with it, but it's yours. And that's when I really started waking up to it. So it's interesting how the codependency itself makes the addiction worse in a sense. Because when somebody's trying to change you, you naturally resist. And the more you resist, the more you get entrenched in the very patterns that are enslaving you. And there's so much codependency in our culture. So, my wife, bless her soul, she always spoke the truth to me. But it's when she began to speak it to herself, and she says, no, I just don't want this anymore. That's when things began to shift.
When you were taking care of so many souls in Eastside Vancouver, did you find yourself holding on to some of that trauma that you were helping others try to release?
I didn't think so. I thought I kept a good distance. I thought I could be empathetic and present for them. And I was, I got an email recently from the sister of somebody who'd been a patient of mine. And he died apparently recently of liver cancer. Probably a complication of hepatitis C, which is probably a complication of injecting drug use. But apparently he mentioned me on his deathbed. I hadn't seen him for 10 years. And his sister said, what he said about you is that you made him feel loved. I made him feel loved. So I could do that for my clients. And I thought I could do so without absorbing their trauma. Until this June, I went down to the Amazon jungle to do a plant retreat, and the native healers who knew nothing about my history, they were not impressed with my persona or my reputation. They had not read my books. They don't watch YouTubes. They don't know that I speak internationally. They just did a ceremony with me, and they said, buddy, you've absorbed the trauma of a lot of people, and we have to clear it out of you. So I hadn't realized to what a degree I'd absorbed it until these native Indian healers in the jungle said, we see it, and we have to get it out of you because it's going to kill you. That's what they said.
Last night we were talking extensively about autoimmune disorders.
Yeah.
Is there a spiritual connection to autoimmune disorders?
Well, you wouldn't be asking that if you share the native North American tradition of the medicine wheel. Because according to the native medicine wheel, there are 4 aspects to our being, or 4 quadrants to our journey in life. And on one level, they represent the body, our psychology, our social relationships, and our spiritual nature. And they say that the 4 have to be in balance, and you have to respect and honor them all. And if any of them is out of balance, you're going to get illness. So, is there a spiritual aspect to autoimmune disease? Yes, there is, but only if we recognize that those 4 aspects of our being are inseparable. And the mind and the body are inseparable. So an autoimmune disease, like rheumatoid arthritis, like multiple sclerosis, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or scleroderma, any number of conditions, means that the immune system turns against the self, hence autoimmune. The immune system is meant to be our defense against foreign invasion by bacteria, and it's also meant to be on guard against malignant transformation on the inside. So the immune cells can recognize what is foreign and dangerous and essentially destroy it. So an autoimmune disease is when that same immune system, which is meant to be your protection and your shield, turns against you. So it's really literally like, I live in Canada, if the Canadian Army invaded Canada with a hostile intent, or if the US Army started attacking the American population, by the way, which it has at various times. Historically, if you look at Eisenhower and MacArthur, these great generals, what they did in the 30s, they attacked, a very famous story, veterans for the First World War who were demonstrating for their rights in Washington, and they were set upon by the American Army, led by MacArthur and Eisenhower. This is not a well-known incident, but Americans don't know their history very well. But to make the point broader, it's as if the American Army invaded the United States with hostile intent. So why does that happen? Well, clearly something has to have gone wrong. So in autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body. So it starts making antibodies or cells that attack the body itself, molecules that attack the body itself. Why does it do that? If you look at who gets autoimmune disease, it's people generally who emotionally have turned against themselves. They suppress their genuine emotions. They suppress their genuine anger. They tend to ignore their own needs, very externally oriented, looking after the needs of others more, essentially ignoring their true selves. Because I know I'm here speaking here in Rochester, Minnesota, home of the Mayo Clinic, and at the Mayo they deal with a lot of autoimmune diseases, but I bet they don't deal with the reality of it, because they're stuck in this very narrow perspective of just the body and the physiology, which is unscientific. If you look at modern science, it's not even controversial to say that you can't separate the mind from the body. And that's not a spiritual statement, that's a physiological statement, that the emotional centers in the brain are inseparable from the activity of the immune system and the nervous system and the hormonal apparatus. So whatever happens emotionally also happens immunologically and also happens in the nervous system. So if somebody suppresses themselves emotionally, they're also going to suppress their immune system or turn the immune system against themselves. Now, why would people suppress themselves emotionally? Because that's how they were programmed in childhood. This isn't a fault of theirs. This isn't a mistake they made. In order to survive their childhood, they had to suppress themselves. In other words, they were traumatized. And anybody with autoimmune disease was traumatized. And no rheumatologist will ever ask. And this happens all the time. I talk to people with severe autoimmune disorders. Adult onset diabetes is one of them, for example, in many cases. Nobody ever asks them about their childhood, about their trauma, about how they feel themselves about emotionally. And yet it's always stress, and it's always unconsciously self-imposed stress. In other words, it's the mind-body unity manifesting itself on the physiological level. I can go on and on about this. I've already said maybe more than your question implied, but let me come back to your basic question of spirituality. Since you can't separate our spiritual self from our psychological self, what is spirituality? Spirituality is our sense of connection and belonging with something larger than our small egos. What happens to people that they're traumatized is they're cut off from their spiritual self. They feel very isolated. They're cut off from that sense of connection. So yes, autoimmune disease on some level represents a spiritual crisis. But it represents a crisis on all levels of our being: physiological, psychological, social, and spiritual. So the answer is inevitably yes, but it's a very complex and at the same time a very simple connection.
What's your definition of psychosomatic, and what role does it play in our life?
So most people these days, when they hear the word psychosomatic, they hear it as a pejorative. And doctors use it that way. There's symptoms of psychosomatic, which means it's just all in the head. They're imagining it, you know. Well, it's interesting because, for example, the word neurotic. If these days when you say somebody's neurotic, you're basically putting them down. You're criticizing them. But originally, neurosis just meant an emotional disturbance. Now, psychosomatic originally wasn't a pejorative either. It just referred to the very meaning of those two words that compound psychosomatic. So psyche, the emotional centers in our brain and our emotional psychological cells, and the soma, which is the body, are one unit. So psychosomatic simply means that the mind manifests in the body, just as the body manifests in the mind. And so from my perspective, most illnesses are psychosomatic, not in that pejorative sense, but in the sense that they represent the unity of mind and body. So you can show, as has been shown, when people are stressed, that changes their adrenal glands and the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and how the pituitary and the hypothalamus and the adrenals work together or they don't work together, or how functional they are. So emotional stress will have a physiological stress impact. So when we talk about psychosomatic, that's all we're saying, is it all belongs together. You can show people in the British Civil Service, the lower down they are in the civil service, the greater the risk of heart disease. In other words, the less control and authority they have in their lives. That's a bigger predictor of heart disease than whether they smoke or not, than whether they have high cholesterol or not. Now that's psychosomatic. That means their emotional functioning manifests on the level of how our cardiac muscle functions and our blood vessels get inflamed or not. So that's psychosomatic. That's what it means scientifically. Psychosomatic is just an expression that mind and body are inseparable.
There's been so much talk about our gut biome and our gut being our second brain.
Yeah.
Where do you feel that falls in Western medicine these days, and is it being pushed to the wayside?
Well, so everything I've said so far does not get recognized in mainstream medical practice. I was talking recently to a leading physician at Harvard, one of the world's leading medical schools. He is the head of a hospital and the head of a major program there. He said that until recently at Harvard, to talk about mind-body medicine was to risk your career as an academic physician. So, It's not even that it's pushed to the side. If I want to push something to the side, I at least have to be aware of pushing something. They're just not aware of this stuff. It doesn't enter. There's no receptors for it in mainstream medicine, by and large. Now, there are honorable exceptions, but I'm talking by and large. Now, the microbiome is a fairly recent field of study. I don't know much about it. I've gathered some articles about it because I'm writing a new book, so I've got to find out what the heck it is. But I haven't read those studies yet. But apparently, of course, a significant percentage of our bodies are not even our bodies. They're bacteria, with which we live in a symbiotic unity. And so that there has to be a balance, having the right kind of bacteria in our guts and so on, for us to be healthy. And then some are and some are not. And so the theory goes, much of our lifestyle these days inhibits the growth of healthy bacteria, and then that contributes to illness. I can't comment on how accurate or how extensive that influence is because I haven't studied it yet. But a lot of people are paying attention to it, and it's one more thing I'll have to find out about.
That'll be a chapter in your new book.
I don't know if I'll have a chapter, but I'll have to find out about it because a lot of people are talking about it, so there's got to be something to it. But you know, I also think in some of the stuff I've seen on the microbiome, people will do anything not to deal with the emotional side of things. So people love to come up with theories for physical illness that don't have to do with the emotions. Because it's very messy and painful and complicated and to deal with the emotions. So I'd rather suspect that for some people, as accurate as the microbiome information may be, I think for some people, it can also serve as a kind of a bypass. So, okay, here's the reason why people are sick. Again, let's not look at the emotions. And that's my area.
Would that be the glue between the continuous talk now between sugar and ADD in children?
Well, so ADD is something I've studied because I've been diagnosed with it myself. Sugar is not the cause of ADD.
Okay.
Sugar will make it worse.
Okay.
These kids are highly sensitive. That's the one thing that's, people talk about ADD being a genetic disorder. It isn't. I mean, nobody knows the science can possibly claim that it's a genetic disorder. There are genes involved, but there are no genes for ADD. There are genes for sensitivity. The more sensitive you are, the more you're going to be affected by the environment. Now, what is the hallmark of ADD? The hallmark of ADD is tuning out, the absent-mindedness. Think about it. What is tuning out? Why do people do it? It's a defense when things are too much. So a defense against what? A defense against stress. So young children are tuning out because there's too much stress around them. That's not the fault of their parents. That's the society they live in. But the parents are stressed. When the sensitive child experiences the parents are stressed, it's too much for them. So they tune out. When does this happen? When the brain is developing. So that the tuning out gets programmed into their brain. Now, sugar, these kids are highly sensitive. They're highly sensitive to the external environment. They're also highly sensitive to the internal environment. You change their blood sugars level, they go nuts. You know, so the sugar is not the cause of the ADD, but it can drive the ADD behaviors because these kids are so sensitive to the internal environment. So yes, it makes a difference, but it's not a causative difference.
Do you ever see a day where we are going to be healing our North American children like they do in South America, taking them to plant healers, say after a car accident or a traumatic episode?
Well, what we need to be doing in North America is to recognize that a child's behaviors and so-called dysfunctions and all this panoply of childhood diagnoses from ADHD to oppositional defiant disorder, which doesn't even exist, by the way. It's just a name for something that doesn't exist, but which describes a certain set of behaviors. But it's not a disorder in the child. But what we're doing is we're creating these diseases of the child, reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, any number, pervasive developmental disorder, autism spectrum disorders. We're creating these illnesses in children, or at least we're projecting that these children have illnesses. What the children really have is stressful and traumatic relationships with the adult world. So therefore, if we're going to heal, and their behaviors and their symptoms are just manifestations of disturbed relationships, which has a physiological impact on their brains and their bodies. So if you're going to heal them, you're going to have to deal with the familial and social and cultural stresses that are driving all these symptoms and behaviors. Now, are we going to take them to plant healers? In North America, no, we're not, because we don't have a big culture of tradition of plant healing like they do in some areas of South America. The plant healing is not the issue. The issue is, are we going to deal with the whole person in the context of their actual relationships, or are we going to isolate them and then isolate their brains and say, you've got a brain disease? That's the real issue. So if you deal with it contextually, and if you deal with it contextually, then you will introduce mindfulness and yoga and rest and play and creative expression and dance and drumming and chanting and art into children's healing. You will do all that. Whether you're being plant centered or not, that's not going to happen in North America in any kind of a large scale.
Just salads.
I don't know.
You put that thing on silent or what?
I thought I had, and I just keep doing. I thought I put on the.
Uncle Dennis, come help.
You know what? I just put it on
please.
airplane. I just put it on airplane mode. I had it on do not disturb mode, but it's not paying attention.
Art, more art.
Sorry.
Art, and more art, right?
Creativity. Mm-hmm. You know, creativity, self-expression. What is the opposite of expression? Suppression. You know, so let kids express themselves. And of course, when you look at school boards and schools, when in these tough times, when politicians make their tough decisions, which usually means they make decisions that are tough on everybody else but themselves, when school programs are cut, what are the first things that are cut? The art programs, the music, the play, the creativity, and the programs to help kids with special needs. In other words, just what's most needed is what's curtailed most immediately.
I'm going to go off the cuff here.
Yeah.
If you had the power, if you had POTUS in front of your name, and you could plant a placebo on society, what would it be?
Well, I have to argue with your very premise.
Oh, let's go.
Okay, because societies don't heal because some powerful, wise healer imposes some kind of solution on them. That's taking the power away from people. You know, and when you take power away from people, even for so-called benign purposes, you're stressing them. Because if you look at what drives stress, one of the things that drives stress is loss of agency, loss of control, loss of autonomy. So there's no solution in the formula that you just raised, okay? So the real question is, what is the nature of this society, and what would it really take for people to be authentically empowered in their lives? And that's not imposed from above. But if I could have the platform of the President of the United States, I would just tell people the truth is the way I see it. And trust that, well, Jesus said it most beautifully. He said, you will know the truth and the truth will liberate you. He didn't say the truth will liberate you. He said you will know it. In other words, so it's the knowledge of truth. You know, and really anybody who's got any kind of a platform, if they just speak the truth, that's what then helps people find the truth within themselves and to act from it. On the other hand, you never become President of the United States if you speak the truth. That's just not how it works. And I don't care which party you belong to. You can have an obvious liar, like your current president. By the way, I'm not even sure he's a liar. I actually believe he believes a lot of the nonsense. For example, when he had his inaugural party, and not that many people showed up, then he said that this was the biggest inaugural party in history, many more than. He's like being a 4-year-old. You know, Barry, the guy before him, had a bigger party. But little Donald can't believe that Barry had a bigger party. And he has to deny it because his ego can't stand it. So when he says it, he's not lying. He just can't accept reality. You know? So it doesn't matter whether he's lying. None of them speak the truth. And you don't become president of the United States by speaking the truth. Because if you speak the truth, you don't become president of the United States. That's just how it works. The system is designed very beautifully to marginalize people who speak the truth.
I just brought up the placebo, but what about people who live for a higher power or a higher power is living through them? What would you say to them then?
Well, I don't have to say anything to them, do I?
Because they already have their own truth?
They already have it, yeah. It happens through me sometimes, and I can recognize it if I step aside. And I also recognize when my ego gets in the way, and then I'm more frantic and I try to do things. To those people, you don't have to say anything. They'll find their own. They already have found their own truth. You know, the problem is that there's so little in our culture that actually promotes or invites people finding their own truth. We're spoon-fed the so-called truth. You know, and this happens on all sides. I mean, again, it's very easy to single out your current president, and for all kinds of valid reasons, but he's only the manifestation of a system. He is a symptom. He's not the cause. You know, and truth is a high value, and that higher power, there's so much in the way of people connecting with it. I mean, you have whole religions dedicated to keep people from experiencing their higher power in the name of a higher power, you know. And you have many cultural manifestations of the same thing. So it's not easy to get there. But once you get there, you don't need advice.
Do you find, with people finding solace in that, do you find there to be beauty in tribalism?
In tribalism?
Yeah.
I love your questions. They're like I never know what direction they're gonna come from.
Stationary astronaut.
So tribalism can be beautiful. It can be horrendous. Tribalism can be a sense of belonging. This is my culture. This is where I belong. I find a home here. I can express myself here. There's a language here that I can speak through. There's rituals through which I can find my higher power. There are practices that honor birth and honor death and honor every milestone in between. That's tribalism in a positive sense. Then there's tribalism in a negative sense of us against them. And we know where that leads to. And a lot of what passes for tribalism is that destructive, hostile aspect of it or manifestation of it. And that leads to, like, I don't know, like, how many Americans actually think about the fact that you guys killed 500,000 Iraqis? You actually killed 500,000 human beings for a total lie, for something that never happened. There's no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was not allied with Al-Qaeda. They were enemies. And your army went in there and killed 500,000 people. In Canada, where I live, indigenous people make up 5% of the population, and they make up 25% of the jail population. And their children are much more likely to die of addiction and suicide. Well, what version, or me as a Jew, I could have been killed, almost was, as an infant, just for being Jewish. Or on the other hand, in the name of that suffering, now we're making the Palestinians suffer. And this is all in the name of our particular group and our tribe. So how do we live with all this stuff? And I'm not blaming, I'm not pointing blame at anybody. You see, people don't even do this deliberately or consciously. So, but when tribalism seizes a hold of us in that negative sense, where we fear the other, where we even identify the other as an other, we're in trouble.
What role does willpower play in the recovery process?
Well, that's a really subtle question, because on the one hand, on the obvious level, it's necessary. You can't heal anybody who's not going to be healed. You can't, John Lennon sang in one of his songs, there's no one you can save that can't be saved. There's no one you can save that can't be saved. If it's not in them, you can't save them, On the one hand. So you have to have that willpower. On the other hand, willpower can be a very facile way to dismiss people. They don't have any willpower. The real question is, what can we do to support people gaining the willpower to find the healing? So willpower is essential, but it's not a moral question. It's an actual question of psychology and brain physiology. And some people have it and some people don't have it, not for intrinsic moral or ethical reasons, but because they either have been able to find it. Willpower is just a part of our essential nature. We can't live without it. So why do we lose it? Why is it crushed in some people? And if it has been crushed in them, how can we help them reconstruct it? And we can. So willpower is absolutely essential, but not in the simplistic sense, but in the sense of what does it take to help people get to a point where their willpower can actually assert itself.
Those 4 quadrants of the native principles you brought up.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about, or has it ever been westernized and given to, say, teaching staff or anything like that to maybe use in their curriculum?
I'm not aware that this balanced view is anywhere present in Western. There might be Western education or Western medical education or Western psychology for that matter. You have some examples of it here and there, but as a systemic awareness of our full unity as human beings, in the West, we are very separated from that.
Last night, while having dinner, we went in depth with your arch nemesis, Jordan Peterson.
Why do you say he's my arch nemesis? I don't know. He's not my arch nemesis. I don't know the guy.
You had some hot takes, very hot takes, and I know Gabor is known for his hot takes.
Yeah.
What is it in regards to, because you were doing some analyzation of him, what would your viewpoint be of Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, well, sure, but let's not talk about nemesis. He's not mine, I'm not his.
Y'all are going to debate on Joe Rogan someday.
Well, that's fine. Peterson is interesting because he's a cultural phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So it's like any phenomena, like Saturday Night Live or the Beatles or Instagram. These are cultural phenomena, And they always tell us something about the culture. So from that perspective, it's interesting to look at quote-unquote Jordan Peterson. Because there's Jordan Peterson the person, then there's Jordan Peterson the cultural phenomenon. Now, as a person, I only know him from his book, 12's Rule for Life, and from what I've seen on YouTube. I read him as a very hostile, very traumatized, choked individual. His voice is choked, which tells me there's a lot of suppressed rage there. I think he's badly hurt. And I think he projects that pain into the world. I think he's very repressed, and I think he acts as an agent of repression. He doesn't mean to. He's very bright. He's very articulate. He's even charming. And in some ways, I rather like him. But when I read what he says about, for example, how do you handle an angry 2-year-old, he says. You make him sit by himself because he has to learn to handle the anger by himself. But that's just the opposite of how you handle an angry 2-year-old. It depends what your goals are. His goals are, Jordan Peterson's stated goal is, you should raise kids that you will like, because if you don't like them, society won't like them either. In other words, the parents are supposed to be the agents of society in fitting the kid into a culture. But what if that's an insane culture? That's the title of my next book, The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. Should the parents really be acting as agents of that culture? Or should the parents be acting as agents of supporting that child's deep sense of individual self-trust and self-respect so that he can face the culture? And so when you say, as he does, you make an angry 2-year-old sit by themselves, why is a 2-year-old angry? A 2-year-old is angry because he's upset about something. And they have no self-regulation yet. Self-regulation is emotional self-regulation is something that develops. It develops if the environment is right. So when you make a 2-year-old sit by themselves because they're angry, you're not teaching them self-regulation, you're teaching them self-suppression. You're teaching them that they're only lovable and acceptable to you if they suppress themselves. Now you set up for now you got to set up for autoimmune disease, which is what Jordan Peterson suffers from, by the way.
Him and his daughter.
And apparently his daughter as well, which to me is not as surprising, given his philosophy. Now, the 2-year-old may be upset about something genuine, like his emotional needs aren't being met, because when are we upset is when we're frustrated. And when we're frustrated when our needs aren't met. Or it might be upset because he's not getting a cookie before dinner. Well, you should not give him a cookie before dinner. But you should know that when you don't give him the cookie, he's going to be upset. And when he's upset, your job is, oh, you're angry, you want that cookie. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, you're not going to get it, but come here, let me give you a hug. You know, in other words, you teach him that the anger is okay, and he'll pass through it. Let him feel this disappointment about not getting the cookie, but don't make him wrong for his anger. Love him, you know. That's how you handle an angry 2-year-old. Now, so he's an agent of repression, which Peterson is, in the personal sense, and he's also an agent of repression in the social sense. Because by and large, he buys into this idea of hierarchy. And he actually says, you know, what's wrong with the hierarchy? Why shouldn't the best people be in charge? Well, that's making the huge assumption that in a society with increasing inequality, it's the best people who are in charge. Yeah. Are they? Are the people who are selling tobacco that murders millions of people the best people? Are the people who are destroying the earth with the pollution and the global climate change, and they're doing this knowing that they're doing it, having known it for decades, and lying about it? I mean, this is not controversial, what I'm saying. What about the Nestle company that encourage junk food to be given to babies so they develop diabetes? Are these the best people? In other words, he's an agent of the hierarchy, and that's why he gets such media attention. You know, now he also taps into some genuine anger in people's part, particularly the anger of displaced and alienated young men. And those people are angry, and they have good reasons to be angry because stuff has happened to them that has marginalized them or has taken away their sense of dignity and power and belonging and agency. And Jordan says one good thing. He says, take responsibility for yourself. I'm 1,000% in favor of people taking responsibility for themselves. But the anger that he manifests taps into that unexpressed and unprocessed rage of a lot of young men. So I think it's a cultural phenomena. His personality and his message kind of are a perfect storm to express a lot of the angst in his culture and a lot of the repression in his culture. So that's how I see him. I don't think he's that important. And I predict that nobody's going to be reading him 10, 15 years from now. I mean, he's one of these cultural phenomena that comes and goes. I don't know, I could be wrong about that, but that's how I see him.
You can't ride Jordan with Labrador. He ain't going to be sticking around. I know there's some burning questions out there. Can we get a handheld down here? And we'll bring some people up to the front here. And I know some people came prepped with some questions who would love an opportunity to ask Gabor a question. Thank you. Don't line up all at once. Who's got a question? Here comes one. Is this Don?
It is.
It is Don.
I met you and I thought, well, this is a very friendly guy. I wonder who he is.
Voila.
Yeah, okay. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. So I have lots of questions. It's my first one is I will have perhaps a half hour with my professional colleagues to teach them what I know about psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Yeah.
And I have plenty of passion to bring to that because of my personal experiences and what I've read and what I know about you. And I've done a little bit of research and I know a little bit about what's going on. And I wonder what you might hope that I would say to them. Or
About
what,
psychedelics? About psychedelics?
yeah, about psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Yeah. Well, so because of the general failure of Western psychiatry to deal with chronic mental conditions, and because that general failure is rooted in a very narrow, biologically reductionist understanding of what we call psychopathology, people are looking for alternatives. Now, if we recognize, just as I said with physical illness is inseparable from people's lives. So is mental illness, so is emotional illness. So that underneath psychosis, underneath depression, underneath bipolar tendencies, underneath anxiety, underneath ADHD, there is trauma and stressed life experience and unresolved emotions as a result of that. Now, any therapy that can open people up to dealing with the underlying emotions and the events in their lives that entrain those emotions in their bodies and their brains will be potentially helpful. So psychedelic means mind manifesting. So, under the impact of a psychedelic substance, you really see what's in your mind. It's a good thing to see what's in your mind because most of what's in your mind is unconscious. Most of us are not aware of the unconscious stuff that drives our daily behaviors, who we love, who we hate, what we do, why we do what we do. So Freud said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. And he went into dream interpretation in a very fuzzy and I think arbitrary and not very helpful way. But he was quite right to look at dreams as manifestations of the psyche. Well, I would say psychedelics are the royal road to the unconscious. They just open people up to see what's in there. And what can be in there is very messy. It can be scary and painful, but it's necessary to look at it. And underneath all that, there's also the deeper true self that we've all got disconnected from. So what if you had an experience that could show you the deep morass of pain and suffering and self-loathing and rage and anxiety that you've been carrying and papering over all your life? And what if, by the same token, you could see that underneath it, there's this whole self that's never been destroyed? What a healing experience that could be. Now, I don't want to romanticize anything, but I've seen people get to those places under the impact of psychedelic substances. As you said, you didn't say psychedelic substances, you said psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So what you're talking about is if people can experience these substances in a guided context where they're well held, where they feel safe, and they're accompanied, well, their healing can really open up. And of course, we know that from the research done so far with MDMA. I know it from my work with ayahuasca, both personally and professionally. So these are potentials. They're not panaceas, but given the dearth of good therapies in the Western psychiatry and Western psychology, given our limited successes, and given the millions of people that are given medications to alter their brains chronically, rather than trying to help those brains heal themselves, the psychedelics are highly promising and, to my mind, worthy exploration.
I'll let somebody else take a turn.
Bravo. Here comes the... Is it possible, I was wondering, is it possible for schizophrenia to be reversed?
Well, first of all, schizophrenia is a very broad category. And so, I mean, there's all ranges of manifestations within what we call schizophrenia. Many more cases are reversible than Western psychiatry imagines. For the most part, Western psychiatry just wants to suppress the symptoms. And sometimes that's necessary, you know, and helpful, and people have been helped, and they can be made function and relatively fulfilled individuals with the right medications. I'm not against medications. But when we only rely on medications, we're just relying on symptom control and symptom suppression. And people can undertake that deep journey that gets them out of their psychosis, that gets them out of their split way of being. So it is, but they need the right context and need the right help, and they need a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of support, just the things that the Western system doesn't provide very well.
Hello, Dr. Maté. That plays very well into my question, actually. Since we don't have a large range of psychedelics here in the Midwest from which to experience healing assistance, what is the path to healing childhood trauma, especially with someone who has diagnosed autoimmune disorders? Is that your next book after The Myth of Normal?
So are you asking which psychedelic or in
Not
general?
which psychedelic, because we don't have...
So not necessarily psychedelic?
Right. Without having access to the psychedelics, which
Without
I
access to
believe are a
psychedelics.
path,
Yeah.
what can we do?
Well, let me tell you about a case of autoimmune disease. A woman I know, she'll be in my next book. In my next chapter, it's going to be an autoimmune disease, what I'm working on now. And she had a disease called scleroderma. And scleroderma is literally means hardened skin. And so in scleroderma, the connective tissue hardened up, and you literally become like this. You can't move your hand. I mean, it's severe. You can't move your fingers. Your face becomes a rigid mask. And she just lay there in her bed. All she wanted to do was die. And she had had every Western treatment. She was at Harvard, for God's sakes. She had all the best possible treatments. They didn't work. What nobody asked her about is her childhood history. Deeply traumatized. Abandonment, sexual abuse, the whole thing. Which led to a certain rigid way of being emotionally, out of self-protection. When she was finally given the help to begin to deal with those dynamics, guess what? Her disease got better. And from being a terminal diagnosis and unable to move without assistance, she's now walking and hiking independently and writing her biography. Now, she's not fully healed yet, but I'm telling you, she's somebody that would have been dead years ago had she been left to the Western medical model. In her case, psychedelics actually were involved. But it's not the psychedelics that provide the healing. The healing is within. The psychedelics just allowed her to see things that otherwise she might have taken much longer to get to. So, if I see somebody with autoimmune disease and have no access to to psychedelics, it doesn't matter. First thing is I want to do, what happened to you? I've written a book called When the Body Says No. And my contention is that when people don't know how to say no, the body will say it in the form of illness. These people with autoimmune disease, they don't know how to say no. They just don't know how to say no. Not as a personal failure, but because in childhood, they had to suppress their self-assertion in order to survive their childhoods. So we help them assert themselves again. We help them to say no. If you look at somebody with multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, if you study them, when they have been studied, what precedes the flare-up is usually some stress that they didn't say no to. So then let the disease be your teacher. Where did I not say no? What belief did I have that forbade me from saying no? Oh, I believed that if I say no, I'm a bad person. Well, is that really true? You didn't express your anger. Oh, because if I'm angry, I'm unlovable. Is that really true? No, that's just the message you got when you were 2 years old and somebody ignored you or punished you because you were angry. So then you suppressed your anger. So now we know that when you suppress your anger, you're suppressing your immune system, physiologically. Let us help you express your anger. Let us help you connect with your true self. Let us help you find that word no in your life. Let us help you find that you're worthwhile and you're as important as all the others on whom you've been putting your attention until now. And when people do that, they heal. And I know such people. So psychedelics can help, but they're not necessary.
Thank you.
There's a magic that happens when people find their purpose in life.
Well, absolutely. The studies are so clear. When people have purpose and meaning, that means to them more. Meaning means more to people than money means to them. You know, give somebody a job with a high salary, but which is soul crushing, and have them engage in something that means something to them, where they're expressing themselves. Guess which activity people will choose most of the time when they're free to make that choice.
I just have a follow-up to that. I have autoimmune disease as well and trauma as a child. Where do you see meditation and out-of-body healing and things on that nature, tapping into your own source of DMT in your brain, that kind of thing?
So for this new book of mine, I got several dozen studies on meditation and mindfulness. And meditation and mindfulness are shown to have physiological positive effects on the immune system, on the brain, and just about everywhere in the body. And that's not surprising, because you talk about trauma, as you did. Trauma happened when there was nobody there to attend to you in a compassionate way. That's why you were traumatized. So what if you start attending to yourself in a compassionate way? There's a wonderful book called The Trauma of Everyday Life by a Buddhist psychiatrist called, and I know his name all the time, and I just can't remember him right now. Anyway.
Thich Nhat Hanh?
No. Thich Nhat. Sorry? Yeah, Epstein.
The assist.
Yeah, Epstein is the name. And thank you, Mark Epstein, yeah. And he points out something very interesting. That's obvious, but I haven't seen anybody point it out before he did. And it even bugs my ego that I didn't realize before I read his book. I should have known this. But I got quite the ego, It won't quit. The Buddha was a traumatized child. His mother died when he was a week old. And when he sits under that Bodhi tree and he meditates, he's giving himself that loving compassion and attention that the mother would have given him. So why wouldn't that be healing? Now, so there's all kinds of evidence that mindfulness meditation is helpful, and we've seen this. They've done studies on people with cancer and this disease and that disease. There's only one caveat, one warning, is that mindfulness and meditation can also work as bypasses. Now, I can name you some examples. There was a death recently, I think 5 weeks ago, of a famous Buddhist monk called Sogyal Rinpoche. He wrote a book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, international bestseller. He founded organizations promoting meditation, especially for people moving close to death in dozens of countries. A lot of people revered him until it turned out he was sexually abusing women in his organization for decades. And here's a guy who's been trained as a lama since he was 6 months old and was a friend of the Dalai Lamas. And I can name you any number of spiritual teachers, especially Buddhist spiritual teachers of meditation, who were predators and abusers, including some of the greatest names. So in other words, you can do all the meditation you want, but if you don't deal with the emotional stuff inside, it's a bypass. So yes, it can be very helpful, but it's no substitute, and it has to be done in conjunction with the emotional work that I keep emphasizing. Because if it isn't, it can just be another ego trip. And for all the good teaching that you do, you're also going to hurt a lot of people. So again, we have to be balanced about it. So going by that medicine wheel, you can't just have the spiritual without the emotional.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Gabor, you said many times that trauma is not taught in medical schools. How do we change that?
Well, it's just a fact that the average medical student in most medical schools does not receive a single lecture on emotional trauma. They should not receive a single lecture on it. They should have a year course in it. Because the ramifications, according to all the science, on your genetic functioning, on your hormonal functioning, on your nervous system functioning, on your gut, on your emotions, are so huge. So as not to learn about trauma is not to learn anything about disease that really matters in a deep sense. I'm talking pure science. The studies have been done. The research has been widely published. So when we say that this is ignored in the medical schools, we're not talking about some fly-by-night, alternative, woo-hoo, new age, pseudo-spiritual perspective. We're talking pure science and pure physiology. So if it's not taught, it's because there's deep resistance to it. And the resistance is systemic and it's individual. And it has to do with the fact, do you know something? Talk about science. I won't go into the details of it, but one study showed that the medical resident in his first year of medical training ages 6 years, not 1 year, but 6 years. That's how traumatizing that experience is, as compared with a non-medical student at the same university. So the resistance is both because we don't want to look at our own internal emotional stuff as would-be physicians or as physicians. Mm-hmm. And it's also systemic in the sense that it would alter the whole medical system if we took the science seriously. So when you say, how do we change it? I have no idea.
Except, right, because the healing is based on the individual.
But I do think that the more patients go to their doctors and say, listen, you better hear me out. I know a woman, I can mention her name because she's written about it, who was treated here at the Mayo Clinic. And she received a wonderful treatment at the Mayo Clinic. Her name is Eve Ensler, author of a book called The Vagina Monologues. Very well-known activist and writer, a wonderful person, who developed uterine cancer, for which she was treated here at the Mayo. And some of these Mayo physicians actually recognized the spiritual aspect of her nature, and that really helped her. But most physicians don't recognize that. And now she was a traumatized person. She was sexually abused by her father, which is typical for gynecological cancers, by the way. Not necessarily, there's always trauma there. Often there's abuse, but there was always trauma. She dealt with that trauma as well, and that's what helped her heal. So some physicians are open to that, most are not. And people have to be willing to say to these doctors, you know, I'm a human being. You got to listen to my whole story, not just look at my body.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Anybody else?
Hi. I work with addicted adult men, mm-hmm. and I see, of course, a ton of trauma in these gentlemen. And I work in intensive treatment, so we only have them for roughly 30 days.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of anxiety, sometimes psychosis, mm-hmm. a lot of depression. Yeah. What would be your suggestion from the mental health aspect and something that I can share with their primary LADCs as to where to begin with these gentlemen? Yeah.
So first of all, it's not surprising what you're describing because addictions, in my view, are always an attempt to escape from some kind of emotional pain. So my mantra is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And the pain is always rooted in deep and troubling life experience, usually in childhood, which is not recognized by most treatment providers. So they're dealing with the addiction as a behavior problem rather than as a crushed soul trying to ease the pain. So all addiction treatment needs to be trauma-informed. That means two things. One is that trauma-informed doesn't mean that every time you see somebody, you talk about trauma. But it does mean that you are informed that when you're looking at an addicted client, you're looking at a traumatized client. That means you treat them with compassion and presence and awareness and an intent to support their healing from trauma. Again, that doesn't mean that you talk about the trauma every time. It does mean that how you speak to them and how you listen to them is informed by your awareness that what their experience has been. The mental illnesses or the mental health conditions that you're describing are similarly outcomes of trauma. So it's not surprising that you'd see mental health issues in people who are addicted. Of course you will. In fact, very often, the addictions are attempts to self-medicate the mental health condition. So as to what you say to your colleagues, you say, first of all, look at the damn science, look at the literature, look at the research. Get aware of the fact that this is all about trauma. So when you speak to them and interact with them, let that inform your approach to them. Number one. Number two, just getting them to stop the behavior cannot be your ultimate goal. Because the behaviors are only symptoms. And unless you deal with the underlying pain, people will relapse. What else can they do? So treatment has to be long-term. So even after they leave your short-term facility, they need to be encouraged and helped to find support for their long-term trauma recovery. So the trauma-informed means how you are with them in the present moment, and then do you engage them in a journey to heal their trauma in the long term.
Thank you. Hi, I am a licensed therapist, and I work primarily.
Could you just hold the mic a bit closer?
Yeah, sorry. I'm a licensed therapist, and I primarily work with trauma and eating disorders. And I'm trained in a body-based modality called somatic experiencing. And I've seen it work really well for a lot of my trauma clients and a lot of clients that come in with autoimmune disorders as well, where their symptoms dissipate and no longer are there. The interesting thing is though, it only goes so far with eating disorder clients. And I've noticed a consistent circle of clients will do okay, and then they'll relapse. And eating disorders are kind of an enigma where there's so many different parts of the person, and especially a lot of them do have trauma. And so I'm just curious to know if you have any insight in how people who are struggling with eating disorders can really actually have relief from.
Okay, so I tell you, I heard you, but I didn't understand you. My hearing is somewhat impaired. Did you, Nick, did you get the question, or were you paying too much attention to your cell phone?
They're going to start ticketing. No. If you have a car parked out front, they're going to start ticketing it. I'm one of them.
Do you want me to repeat it?
Is it okay if I stand up and move a little bit?
Enter the promised land.
Yeah, so listen, let me come a bit closer. Give me the question again.
I was asking about how with eating disorders
okay,
are one of the, in my opinion, most difficult disorders because there's so many different moving parts. And what I've noticed is that clients will do so well for so long, and then there's a relapse. And even if we go through and we explore the trauma through the body, and there's a lot of other other things that we can do, there's still this component that leaves them stuck.
And what happens for you when that happens?
I feel really sad for them. I get frustrated.
Okay, you can't help them from that position.
Yeah.
So the first thing you got to do, you got to deal with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because eating disorder is like an addiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it has the same function as an addiction of temporary relief and release.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, if it's an addiction, what are you going to expect? You're going to expect relapse.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to work with addicts or people with an addictive-like phenomenon, and you're going to get sad and frustrated, you can't help them.
No.
So the first question I have for you is, what are you doing for yourself? So that you don't get, so let me ask you, what do you get frustrated about?
I think my level of capacity to help them.
What do you get frustrated about? That you can't help them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or that eating disorders are so difficult.
That's not what it's about.
No.
You get frustrated because you can't help them, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
You have an underlying belief that you should be able to help them, right?
Yes.
And you have another underlying belief that if you don't help them, there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
Right. Now let me ask you this question. How old were you when you first witnessed suffering that you couldn't do anything about?
2.5.
2.5? It's the 2.5 that's showing up in you, frustrated and sad. Okay? You got to deal with that 2.5-year-old. And when you do, you'll know what to do with your clients.
Okay.
Okay?
That makes sense.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Here we are. with the host for tonight, Giselle Ugarte, one of my great friends. She was the host of last year's Where the Minds Meet as well. We have one of the planet's leading ethnopharmacologists on the planet, Uncle Dennis McKenna. We call him Uncle Denny, so when you leave here, when you approach him,
he calls
it's Uncle Denny.
You're the only one. Okay.
I don't call him that.
That's all right.
And then we've got Joe Tafur. Joe Tafur is the author of The Fellowship of the River. Joe, I pinpointed to come here today because of his ability with epigenetics and his wisdom behind it. And Joe is someone who I look up to, and I really feel he was going to be able to provide value to this panel. So please give these folks a round of applause quick. Joe, I'd like to start with you. What got you interested about the study of genetic memory?
Genetic memory or epigenetics, what got me into studying epigenetics was my work in the Amazon. And so that's one of the themes of the book, was seeing the kind of healing that was happening with traditional Amazonian plant medicine and ayahuasca, and as a doctor trying to find the connection between these very different kinds of problems. How come the person for depression is getting better with the same treatment that we're using for addiction, with the same treatment we're using for this Crohn's disease case or this other autoimmune problem. And so if it's all getting better from the same kind of treatment or a related treatment, then the thought is that they have some kind of related physiology. And when we're trying to figure out what was the relationship between their healing, what happened, and it turns out, well, it was all about healing emotional trauma. So then it was trying to find out, well, where is the physiology of emotional trauma? And there's just a growing body of evidence that maybe epigenetics is where we can kind of pinpoint and find that stuff in the molecules. And so that's how I got interested in epigenetics.
Fumble. He's an Arizona Cardinals fan, so he's used to it.
Oh, yeah. Here it goes. Now, this thing came off my belt, man. You got a cheap microphone? What's going on? It's all tangled.
You're clicked on. There we go. And Dennis, you just ended up in the jungle one day.
What's that?
You just ended up in the jungle one day. You and your brother.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I guess you could put it that way. You know, we grew up in the 60s. We were immersed in that culture at that time. But you know, my brother was going to school in Berkeley, and I was stuck in a small town in Colorado, wishing I was out there on the West Coast where the action was. And of course, it was a time of cultural ferment, and you know, the psychedelic of the day was LSD, which was causing a lot of social disruption, a lot of it needed probably at that time. But what came onto our radar was DMT. And DMT seemed a whole of a different magnitude, a whole different order than LSD. It seemed like something very special. And we had a lot of funny ideas about it. We were immersed in science fiction at the time. We weren't coming at this from a spiritual angle. We were essentially coming at it from the angle that we thought this could actually open up a portal to another dimension. And we were experimenting with DMT. The problem was that DMT has such a short time of action that you can no sooner get immersed in the experience than the experience is almost over. And what motivated us to go to South America to look for an orally active form of DMT that we had heard about in the ethnobotanical literature, something derived from a genus of trees called Virolas. It was an orally active form, and we naively thought that if you could take it orally, DMT is not active orally by itself. It requires monoamine oxidase inhibitors to inhibit the enzymes in the gut that break it down. But this is the basis of ayahuasca pharmacology. It's made from 2 plants, at least 2, but one of which contains DMT, The other contains beta-carbolines, which are potent monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So that was the basis of ayahuasca's.
Which is the ayahuasca vine.
The ayahuasca vine, is the vine itself, and the brew is called ayahuasca, just to confuse people, right? But at that time, 1971, this was not understood. These admixture plants were not really studied at that time. This was just beginning. So we heard about this Varola preparation, which charmingly enough was called ukuhe in Witoto, and we thought, aha, this is it. This is the secret. We have to go look for this. So we gave up our careers and basically everything else to sashay off down to the Amazon with 3 equally impassioned friends and look for ukuhe. And the reason we went to La Chorrera in the Colombian Amazon is because that was the historical ancestral home of the Witoto people that supposedly had preserved this secret. Well, when we got to La Chorrera, our priorities were quickly rearranged because we found, number one, we had been cautioned by an anthropologist who we'd encountered on the way in that we couldn't just walk into a village and start talking about ukuhe. They would take great exception to that because this is supposed to be the big secret of the shamans, right? The fact that, and we looked like we'd stepped right out of Haight-Ashbury, which essentially we had. So we were far more colorful than the Witoto. We had beads and bells and beards and all that. But we were looking for that. When we got to La Chorrera, we found that the area around of the mission village had been cleared to pasture, and there were Cebu cattle there that had been brought in, and the dung of Cebu cattle happens to be the preferred substrate for Psilocybe cubensis, which is one of the more potent global psilocybin mushrooms. And we had never had any experience with it. We knew what it was from our homework, but when we got there, we were delighted because we said, well, this is fantastic. We could have fun with these while we wait for the real secret to emerge. Well, they quickly reordered our priorities and made it clear that they were the real secret. And so we started experimenting with those and using them probably in a fairly reckless manner.
As a diet, though. It was part of your diet.
It was, well, yes.
Because you were starving.
There wasn't a whole lot to eat there. And, besides rice, and we couldn't even get beans, so they do make a nice omelet.
At what point did you and your brother start seeing spaceships?
Only later in the process.
Joe, have you heard this story?
I read Invisible Landscapes.
Yes, well, it's recounted more honestly in Terence's book, True Hallucinations, and my book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And I had to write my book in order to correct some of what's in True Hallucinations.
All right.
The real story. But I don't want to get deeply into the details of this right now, but suffice it to say that it downloaded a lot of information to us about what we could do with voice and sound and mushrooms and all that to create, to open up this portal into space-time that we hypothesized that we could create. Well, of course, that was impossible, so other results were happened instead.
I would like to empathize that with Joe's story and his kind of inkling to get into epigenetics. Do you feel that it was downloaded into you, Joe, to start studying it?
Yes, in my case, and that's I'm going to tell that story later this evening as part of my talk. So maybe I don't want to just say it twice. It's in the book, but that basically I had an experience while I was, and I was in the Peruvian Amazon. My family's from Colombia, but I spent a lot of time in the Peruvian Amazon, and I went through traditional training with the Shipibo tradition, and to work in ceremony, and to work on people in ceremony. And so for us, that's singing Icaros to them. That is part of the healing and energetic healing that you're you're performing, back to like, what's possible with sound and voice and, these realms that the local culture has explored extensively, and they have whole training methods to develop that. And in that development, you also are trying to develop your visionary capacity with ayahuasca and beyond that within yourself. And so in singing to somebody that was needing some help, I received the message that their problem was not in their genes, but on their genes, and with some imagery that guided me to start exploring epigenetics. So then when I started exploring epigenetics from that, which I had a vague, awareness of epigenetics as a doctor, et cetera, but not very much. And then the cases that I was presenting in the book, I began to say, okay, well, maybe there's some epigenetics, some evidence of epigenetics being involved in this kind of case. And in each case, there was evidence. Gabor just gave his talk here just about how little discussion of these things, especially, when I was in medical school, some years ago, we didn't talk about this. And so where is the trauma and how does it get imprinted into the system? Where is the imprint? Where can we find it? And so that's how I was directed was, through the plant medicine, but through my training, through my, experience there.
Now, does epigenetics play a role in cortisol levels? Our stress hormone?
It can. So then that's one of the topics is, as we try to explore this topic of what I'm trying to promote, the discussion of emotional biology. And I think that's what, Gabor has been implying with all of his work of like this network that he talked about or that we talked about of the way your psychology and the psychosomatic and the way your psychology is connected to your physiology of your body and the function, which includes cortisol levels, which we know kind of vaguely in the community, maybe people are aware that your fight or flight response is related to cortisol response. And when people are heavily stressed, that alters their cortisol production, their cortisol cycle in the day and the way cortisol is produced in the body. And so, yes, we know that stress and PTSD and examples like that, they influence that system. And so it seems that, yes, we don't have it all pieced together so neatly. There's a lot of speculation that yes, some epigenetic imprinting related to emotional trauma would affect cortisol levels. I believe that to be true. It's still being proven out.
There's been so much talk, Dennis, about microdosing. Last year in Costa Rica, we spent some time together, and you had compared microdosing LSD to microdosing psilocybin, and you said there was a stark difference. Could you point out the difference between the two, what they do to your neurochemistry?
Well, microdosing is kind of all the rage now, and people are microdosing with different substances. I think what we talked about in Costa Rica, it's not that there's a stark difference. The psilocybin and LSD seem to be the two medicines that people are microdosing with. There's a concern about LSD, about microdosing with LSD as opposed to psilocybin, which doesn't really seem to have any safety issues, but the whole thing is a large uncontrolled experiment. If people microdose over many years on a daily or every other day basis, we don't know what the long-term effects of that might be. And there really needs to be some clinical studies. Microdosing seems to have some benefits, but specifically in the case of the differences between LSD and psilocybin, LSD binds into the receptors, the serotonin receptors, in a unique way, so that part of the receptor bends over and holds it in place, holds it into the binding pocket in a way that does not happen with psilocybin. Psilocybin dissociates rather readily. LSD has a different dissociation constant, it's called, and it sits there and it's constantly exerting this agonist effect, this stimulating effect on the serotonin receptors. Now, LSD is not we all probably know that the psychedelic effect is related to a particular subset of these receptors, the serotonin 2A receptor. Stimulation seems to be something that all the psychedelics, what I call the true psychedelics, have in common. LSD is one of these, but LSD hits other receptors, like most drugs do, and it interacts with other serotonin receptors. One of these is the 5-HT2B receptor. And this has been associated with a condition called valvular proliferation or a valvular heart disease. Stimulation of that 2B receptor can cause proliferation of valvular tissue in the heart. There's no way to reverse that except a valve transplant. And a couple of serotonergic drugs at the late 90s did this and were taken off the market, for that reason. Fen-phen, you may have heard of it was a combination of fenfluramine and another drug. And this condition began to show up. And so LSD those drugs were removed from the market because of this side effect. Now, I don't want to alarm people and say, well, LSD will cause this condition if you microdose it. The honest answer is nobody knows, but it does interact with the 5-HT2B receptor. It's possible. It should be looked at, and I think microdosing with LSD should be approached with caution for that reason. And psilocybin doesn't have that problem. So if you want to microdose, psilocybin might be a better choice. You may have things to say about this.
Yeah, I actually am not, I am a doctor, but I am not familiar with the 5-8, this 2B receptor effect with LSD.
You haven't heard of this?
I haven't heard about it yet. It hasn't come, but I haven't been following it that closely.
Okay.
So, but it's a risk that's been raised and it needs to be explored. And I think that that's very important. As the knowledge base grows, we have to explore. And if it's related to the fen-phen effect, I don't know.
The answer is we just don't know, and I think caution. If people want to. You can look on PubMed about this, but you can also go to the Hefter Research Institute site, hefter.org, and look at the blog. And there's a piece there about this potential problem. So people might want to look at that.
That's what's exciting right now is the psychedelics discussion is coming out into the open. So if there are real safety concerns, then we can discuss them.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the positive things that's happening, thanks to them the brothers going down to Columbia all the way to where we are now. Now we're talking about it this way, by the Mayo Clinic.
All because they were hungry.
Well, I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm a human. I know we have a sprinkle of all of that in the audience. So for me, I think my biggest question is, why would someone microdose and for how long? And what is the problem that it's trying to solve? Because I think that that's a question that a lot of people feel silly asking for those who are really deep down the path and are really into the science of it all. Because I do think that, even though you say that things weren't understood in the 70s and the 80s, it's still not understood now. And people still think that microdosing or plant medicine is, hippies dropping acid at work. And that's not, that's not what it is. So explain, in the most human terms, what is the solve for that?
I'm not an expert on microdosing, so I've just been observing the phenomenon, and I have mixed feelings about it. I think what's being popularized, in the kind of the podcast world or whatever, optimization, Silicon Valley, or that's what I hear about it. Is I've got this down, I've got that down, I've got this, I got the money, I got this, I figured out that, Now what's the next step? Microdose to be more productive at work, to be more creative. That's what I've heard a little bit. And so I think that's why some people seem to be doing it or seem to be interested. Other people are curious to see if maybe it can help them with some depressive symptoms. That's instead of taking Prozac, maybe I could take this, I can access it myself. I just take it every few days. And so then I guess it becomes kind of a treatment, like a regular treatment. And in both cases, I guess it's some kind of regular treatment. And it just, for me, it opens the question of, and it's related to everything, it's just like, okay, well, what's going on there? And what are we treating with that? And is there something, what is the pathway towards optimization? What is the pathway towards increasing creativity? Does it involve healing, ultimately? Is there a healing process that maybe you could go through more deeply that maybe wouldn't necessarily require a regular, bump? I don't know. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it lately.
Yeah.
It's really helped catapult a conscious connection, and without having to go down to the jungle, without having to, end up in your underwear in a bathtub. You know what I'm saying? Without having to go deep down the wormhole.
Yeah.
I mean, like Dr. Tafur, I have reservations about microdosing besides the issues that we just discussed. I have reservations about it too. For one thing, the evidence that it does have this enhancing effect on cognition and so on, that's anecdotal. There's no study so far that really can demonstrate that, and that's okay. There needs to be a study. I mean, everyone makes their own choices. Mm-hmm. In some ways, I think, maybe the more serious aspect of microdosing is it's an excuse for many people to be involved in psychedelics without having to take a macro dose. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the macro dose is sort of the point of psychedelics. Yes. People can microdose for a long time and never really realize that, just around the corner, so to speak, is a world of wonder that they might do well to explore. And I think that people should keep that in mind. And I think the microdosing may well be useful for reinforcing some of the revelations and even reorganize neural connections that you can achieve through macrodosing. The microdosing might help epigenetically, again, to keep those processes going, reinforce them. Microdosing in itself is not sufficient.
Our ancient ancestors, Dennis, you had brought up something regarding hunter-gatherers microdosing to enhance their senses to be able to kill for their food that night.
Well, people do use these substances to increase visual acuity, for example, to give energy. These are not necessarily microdoses, though. These can be, macro doses. I mean, who knows? But, again, it's speculation. And it's possible. But certainly in the Amazon, there are various tribes that use not necessarily the plants we know about, but to increase visual acuity. And one of the popular sort of drug tourist things that people do now is to take sapo or kambo, which is another amphibian-derived. It's not a psychedelic. It's a bunch of peptides that does many things to you. But the Matsis Indians who use it, traditionally, they use it as hunting medicine. They take the venom they exude the venom and they apply it to burns in the skin. It's a kind of a grizzly, it's a kind of a Bear Wires approach to it. But they use it for hunting medicine.
Where do you think, and Joe, you probably know this from the tradition of Shipibo, where did they even come up with these the wisdom to put these compounds together to the point to beat the gut biome and to get to the liver and to be able to blast off?
Well, they believe that, and there's different stories and there's different legends and different ways. In the Shipibo tradition, for example, there is a tradition of dieting with master plants, that you go into this period of purification, a period of cleansing in a natural situation. So first of all, just like when you go and spend a lot of time in nature, the way you would tune into the natural environment, the way you tune into your apartment or to your car, how automatic and unconscious the connection becomes. So when you live in a natural setting, fixed without a lot of other influences, that has a profound influence on your consciousness. And we see that, in native peoples all over the world, you can kind of tell, the way they're connected to where they're living, like everywhere else. So there's that going on, and then they go through this, they had this tradition to try to connect to plant spirits. They reported that plants were talking to people in their dreams. Somebody would have a dream, oh, you should do this, oh, you should take this plant. So the following your dreams component of life, that was also much more encouraged to explore, and they want to know, well, what did you dream about, and what did the kid imagine? They want to hear from that side of things. And so that was a source of information, and then this idea of going through these prolonged periods of dieting and taking a master plant that's not known to be psychoactive, but that's believed to have some kind of teaching properties. The master plants, planta maestra, means teacher plant. So you take that, and so they say that the plants told them to find ayahuasca and find the vine, and through dreams and through messages that way, it was intuited through those kind of experiences.
Is it possible for us as a Western civilization to ever even get to that point, to have a relationship with the plants like that?
Of course it is, So it's like, if you're a Westerner, do you still have an intuition? Yes, you do, When it comes to sports, it's very, superstitious environment, or music, or there are all kinds of feeling, all kinds of, spontaneous, unconscious, movements at a rock concert. So that's very real. The intuition art is there. So it's that same thing. There's many people that love to go hiking and camping and be outdoors and have experiences, with a deer or whatever it is. Most people around here probably have had some kind of experience like that. So it's extremely natural for the human being, no matter how civilized. It's part of the system. Here we are, the descendants of our ancestors. No question. I am Earthling. We're saying I don't know, you said the best, the most, what, yeah.
We don't know what Dennis
You're indicating. I believe that I am. I believe I am an Earthling, and as far as I can tell, from what I understand in this whole space exploration situation, is that the guy that's been up there the longest from zero gravity is so damaged, I don't know if he's still so damaged, that it's not a reality at all currently, this space exploration for the human being. So I am of this earth, and I know that I am. And so that's part of our capacity, just like the magic that the animals demonstrate and the plants demonstrate. Yes, we have that capacity.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of building off what you say, it's important to remember that ancestrally, and even still now, although our relationship, we become increasingly estranged from nature, but indigenous people and prehistorical people evolved in this complex chemical environment in a way, and not just the psychoactive plants, but they, as they developed omnivory, which is something that the controlled use of fire made practical, then they could expand their diet. And plants are full of secondary compounds of all kinds that mediate relationships between, that's how plants do their thing with the environment. They do it through chemical communication. And the neurotransmitter-like chemicals that plants made, we shouldn't be surprised that they resemble our neurotransmitters because we came from the same origins. And one of the things I think that psychedelics can do, especially when they're taken in nature, is they can bring the background forward. We are programmed to suppress most of what we experience. This is part of what Robin Carhart Harris calls the default mode network. A lot of what the default mode network is gating mechanisms to make sure that not too much information gets through because you couldn't handle it. Psychedelics, to take a psychedelic is to temporarily disable that and let information come through that normally would. So you notice things if you're in nature about your environment that you would normally just ignore because they're not an immediate threat. They're not a saber-toothed tiger about to attack you, but they're still important. And so that ability to expand what we can notice about our environment is, I think, one of the most valuable things about psychedelics, and this was important for indigenous people. If you go into the forest with an indigenous person, especially if they're pre-literate or illiterate, they're in a different world than you are. You're in the same forest, you're in the same place. They're seeing and noticing things that you don't until they're pointed out. So I think that psychedelics are tools for that, and that may partially speak to, the intuition that leads someone to say, well, we have these two plants here, and something tells me that if we brewed them together, it would be interesting. Something interesting would happen. So going on that, shamans and plant medicine people are inherently experimental ethnopharmacologists. You can think of them that way. They discovered the medicinal properties of all these plants by mucking around with them, experimentally. Take it, see what happens. And I think that's how they discovered it. There's an interesting paper in this symposium that was presented, and now it's in here, Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. You should all buy one. There's only 16 copies.
Buy two.
What's that? But anthropologist Manolo Torres has a brilliant paper in this book where he talks about a certain area of Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru, where they come together, where there's a very active chicha culture and many kinds of chicha. And it was like, almost the craft brewery approach to chicha. And people made choices about what to include in the chicha. And at some point, accidentally, they might have, and also Banisteriopsis was in this area, and we used for other things. Banisteriopsis is often used by itself without admixtures. So it was an area where these discoveries might have been made almost accidentally.
If it was used without mixes, what would that be strategically used as just a medicine, non-psychoactive?
If what?
If it was used without a mixture?
It's
kind
not,
of like
it's not that it's not
ayahuasca.
psychoactive. It is psychoactive. It is not perhaps psychedelic or hallucinogenic. That comes from the tryptamines, but the beta-carbolines we're now finding have their own spectrum of psychoactivity, which is more subtle, but definitely there. In fact, some of the more exciting discoveries that are being made about ayahuasca are some of the, going back and looking at these beta-carbolines and trying to sort out what role do they play. Well, we know they're monoamine oxidase inhibitors, but it goes beyond that. So there's a lot of work, and then ethnopharmacologically, there's a lot of other species in the same family that are used. And by no means is the pharmacology or the chemistry or the botany of ayahuasca as a plant medicine complex been completely explored. I think there's more to learn, much more.
Can you explain the difference between psychoactive and psychedelic? And if it is psychedelic, does that automatically mean that it is hallucinogenic?
Can you repeat that?
The difference between psychoactive and psychedelic. And if it is psychedelic, does that automatically mean that it is hallucinogenic?
And what was the first term?
So psychoactive.
Well, okay, so yeah, this terminology is very loose and it's not very useful. Psychoactive potentially could be applied to anything that affects psychological functions. So, a tranquilizer is psychoactive, an antidepressant is psychoactive, a cup of coffee is psychoactive. All of these things affect the nervous system and they affect, our state of mind. They're not all obviously psychedelics. When you get more narrow, when you say something is hallucinogenic, that's kind of an older term that came along the same time psychedelic did, and it was acceptable in biomedical circles. You could use that in a paper or so on about these things. Psychedelic seemed like an inappropriate term, but it's not really. It's a better description because these things do not necessarily cause hallucinations, which is what hallucinogenic means. Occasionally they do, but that's not invariably a character of how they work. And psychedelic is again a vague term, but maybe more accurate because what it means is mind manifesting, and they do manifest the mind. But I admit that the terminology is loose. Psychedelic is now a respectable term, again, and that's partly a result of a lot of the research that's showing, their therapeutic potential and all that. So now you can use psychedelic in a paper, for example, and not be vilified for it. The terms are not very good. You can tell by the proliferation of terminology that exists. So we, another one that people like to use is entheogen, which means generating God within, but I don't like that term because they don't all do that, and they don't invariably do it. Another one is psychotomimetic, meaning they mimic psychosis. Well, they don't really do that either. So terminology is a problem with these things, and you have to have good terminology to talk about it.
But psychedelic is because, like you're saying, it's getting published. And
it's kind of the default term, and it's vague enough that it's useful. Yeah, it manifests the mind.
Well, I like to
without
point
being
out
specific about how it manifests the mind.
I like to point out that psyche, it's been kind of a little bit twisted in the translation. Psyche means soul,
right,
in Greek, and that's and soul and mind, and the kind of the broader. So there's a spiritual component to the origin of the word, and so it's been infiltrated into our discussion of psychosomatic, psychedelic, psychiatric, psychological, psychic.
Right.
Like those are all interrelated
all
terms
root.
rooted in that. So I think there's a spiritual element of the term that I think gets a little bit discarded when people say mind manifesting, mind. When there's another element, what he's talking about with the default mode network, with the research they're showing, is like actually they're seeing their mind is changing in a very different way that's allowing for all this sensory input to come in unfiltered from the outside world, but also from the inside. So now they're feeling things from within themselves that what we call interoception, emotionally, bodily sensations, become conscious and reveal all kinds of stuff. And then there's another little common component to this research. When they turn this default mode network function down in certain ways with psychedelics, then many of them have a mystical experience at the same time. And so that's really interesting that this default mode network seems to be part of there's a lot of things that it does, and some people are saying it's a neural correlate of the ego. It's also like kind of part of our hyper-conditioned brain. It's some of our autopilot is there. So when you have this over-conditioning, this society that's over-conditioning people to close off their input from sensory world, whether it's screen time or whatever, or close off how you feel, because you know what, I don't really like my job. I don't really like anything about this. But here we go, it's Monday, everything sucks. Shut it down and just keep going. Why are we doing this anyway? I don't know, man. Just life sucks, So that kind of culture, and the hyper conditioning of the dissociation of our experience of the world outside of us and how we feel inside, and how those two things are actually very closely correlated, at least in our experience, of people's access to something mystical. That we have evidence to demonstrate that those things are interrelated. And so when that hyper conditioning happens in a certain kind of way, or whatever it is, the scarring that closes people off from their feeling too much trauma, too much unaddressed trauma, no release, no healing, get over it, whatever. That's what it. And so then now that's associated, this overactive default mode network at certain regions is associated with anxiety. It's associated with depression. Okay, PTSD is a form of anxiety, associated with addiction. These are the main targets of psychedelic medicine right now. And so it's just, all these things are interrelated. And so that's why, you know, and, you know, he kind of mentioned it, it's like when we talk about microdosing, and it's like, okay, yes, like you probably are tapping into that, you know, you're tapping that along, and maybe that's good, and it's introducing people to something that, because their culture has blocked them off from this intuition, this feeling, right? You're told, no, that's nothing, you know, the science and the material, you know, the spiritual, the mystical, that's maybe at a rock concert, you know, maybe at a big sports event, but not at the doctor's office, you know, not there. Maybe with your friend, maybe with your loved one, maybe with somebody you can be really honest with, but not in a public setting, you know. So all that kind of stuff. So then the micro dose, maybe that does help. But then the thing is like, well, maybe it's just like tapping on it. Maybe we need to go deeper. Maybe in some cases it's a deeper trip to really see what's past that. Or it could be other methods. It doesn't have to be psychedelics, you know. It could just be holding space for somebody to really feel, you know, as simple as that. So I don't know, I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
I could listen to you talk all day, Joe.
Yeah.
We have to get into crowd questions, though, because I know some people did come here interested in talking about plant medicine. So do we have a microphone that we can get some of the guests? Yeah, you can go down with that one. Our host with the most, Giselle. Oh, we got another one.
This is why I wore sneakers.
Do we have anyone who wants to ask these two doctors or even Giselle a question?
Thanks.
He's off.
Let's see, okay. In your opinion, is it necessary to have a pristine environment to be able to find the pharmaceuticals or experience these other feelings that might come from the forest? Because in my opinion, we don't have anything like a pristine environment. You couldn't do that in these woods because, in fact, half the botany that was once in these woods is not available to us.
Did you hear?
You have to repeat it, or you either have to yell or somebody's got to repeat it.
I'll start answering it. Maybe you can hear me.
Okay.
I guess the question was, do you have to be in a certain pristine environment to make the most of these kind of experiences? And like outside of the Amazon rainforest, or, you know, he says that this environment here, even the woods here, was not, he doesn't believe that it's sufficient to provide for that because of the biodiversity that's been destroyed and all the destruction and the history and all that stuff. Well, you know what I mean? That's what we got. And so set and setting is very important, right? We know that set and setting is a really big deal.
Right.
And so that's a really big deal. So it is really important, you know, in what kind of setting you explore these experiences. Yeah. That being said, if we look at the example of psychedelic research, let's say, you know, with the MDMA trial for PTSD, really big deal. These people are really suffering with PTSD. And so they create an environment. They create an environment in a room. It's a research protocol, so they have to have a couch and it's an office. But they hold the space in such a pristine way, the therapist, you know, the immaterial element, acknowledging grieving the losses of the biodiversity, you know. So that's how we hold that space. We don't say, that's nothing. We say, we have not yet fully grieved, you know, the loss. So we acknowledge that. And so in acknowledging it now, we can also do whatever else we can to try to hold the space for some kind of healing or some revelation to happen. So we try to be as honest as we can. We try to be as pristine as we can, but we reach for an ideal. You know, not just like this is what happened and we're screwed, right? We're still reaching. That's what we need more of in the society, I believe.
Yeah, I think again the question goes to the issue of set and setting, which is very important. You have to have. I don't think you have to have a pristine environment or even an outside environment to get the most out of psychedelics. The important thing is that you have a well-structured environment. It can be indoors, but you should think about what kind of a place you want to do it, what do you want to have available, maybe art books or something to interact with during the experience. Ideally, an experience in nature is good, but not inherently superior. It depends on what you want to get out of it. But the thing that sets psychedelics apart from any other psychoactive medicine or any medicine is that they can never, if you're looking for them for therapeutic effect, the healing comes from within, not from the medicine, and you have to have a context for that. So it's never take two and call me in the morning. You have to have preparation for the experience, you have to have therapeutic support during the experience, and integrative support following up the experience to really get the most of the therapeutic potential of these things. People can take them on their own and they may benefit, but if you're looking for specific, therapeutic outcomes that can be quantified and measured, you need these fairly highly structured environments. And the variables are the setting is important, and certain settings are appropriate for certain kinds of experience. The set is often characterized as your intention, but I think it goes way beyond that. The set is what you bring to it. The set is you, and all your experiences, your memories, your expectations, all of that is part of the set. And then there's the medicine and the dose, and those affect, the phenomenology of the experience as well. So it takes a lot of planning and thoughtfulness to construct the right setting as appropriate, depending on what you're hoping to get out of it.
Did you get your answer?
My question is, what's your opinion on disorders such as bipolar, schizophrenia, and personality disorders with psychedelics, including psilocybin and ayahuasca?
The question is, what's the opinion on bipolar and schizophrenia and certain borderline personality disorders, and trying to treat them with psychedelics, ayahuasca, etc., psilocybin? Well, so, there are risks. So here we are talking about the good sides and, all the positive possibilities. There's very real risks, and I personally have been participated and watched, when somebody with a history of, let's say, manic episodes and bipolar disease or bipolar disorder has been pushed into a very troubling manic episode with ayahuasca. It's a documented phenomenon. They published a paper on this, and it's a known thing that it's a high-risk situation. So I say prolonged mania, I'm talking about days and days and days needing psychiatric intervention to come down, not responding to traditional attempts to bring the person down. Same thing, I have observed it with undisclosed schizophrenia and somebody who had a history of psychosis also being pushed into a psychotic state that got worse and worse over the course of days, ended up getting deported from Peru. So those are real things. So when people write, for example, I'm no longer a business partner anyway, Rao, but I was in Peru, and so I had to handle the emails, and everyone's like, oh, I'm so desperate, can I do it? But I have bipolar, I've had mania or schizophrenia. And it's like, well, this is what happened with the people that we did it with, so it's very high risk, and no, we don't do that here. And so I think that there's people are still curious for a hope. In borderline personality disorder, well, there's degrees, and there's people talk about this dissociative kind of tendency of complex trauma. So it depends. I've run into a few people that were diagnosed and they've done well, but a very difficult course that they went through. So most of the time, I think it's a very difficult course. Bipolar and schizophrenia is high risk, concerning, may not be beneficial in those cases. There's some people exploring that. They'd like to see some way, some hope. I have not seen it myself yet, so I tell people be very careful with that. Borderline personality, it's a more mixed picture, it's more complex, there's a big spectrum, as he mentioned about schizophrenia recently, Gabor. So you kind of have to see, but the person has to be ready, set, They have to be ready to do this integration. And so it was at Plant Spirit Medicine, which is going on right now, and Dennis is on his way over there for Spirit Plant Medicine. I can't remember what it's called.
Spirit Plant Medicine.
Spirit Plant Medicine is a conference in Vancouver. They had some Native Americans there, and one of the Native ladies wanted to come out and kind of speak out against this open invitation to psychedelics and plant medicine to to everybody. She says, no, that's not for everybody. That's for people with strong minds that are ready to work through what they're going to have to work through. Plus, by the way, like a supportive community can play a big factor depending on where the person's at. And then that they need to be, she was like, they have to be coming from a good place in their heart. If they're corrupted in their heart, it's not necessarily going to fix that either. So, I think it is a reality. You have to really think, okay, is this person going to be able to work through these, this experience and come through this experience and can find a stable place to work through the rest of their experience. So if they're not, then, it's irresponsible.
Psychedelics are not for everybody. And one of Dennis's friends, I was at his conference up at the U of M a few years ago, and I'm not going to say his name, but he ended it with more ayahuasca for everybody. And I strongly questioned him that after the fact, because these compounds are not for everybody. There are people in here who have probably not indulged themselves, and you might not ever need to. Just getting answers from medical doctors like Joe up here and plant scientists like Dennis, that might be good enough for you. Psychonauts, go talk to one. And if they're not normal, you might not ever want to indulge.
Well, a couple of things might be relevant to say here. One of them is that psychedelics aren't for everyone, but there are other ways to get there. Yeah. And that's where these meditative practices and other practices, it may be a little longer path, but you can get there without psychedelics. And they're not incompatible. There's 2 new papers that just came out recently from Franz Vollenweider's lab in Zurich. He's one of the leading psychedelic researchers, showing that people with a meditative practice pre-existing, when they took psilocybin under controlled conditions, the results was that their psilocybin has been shown to increase the characteristic of positivity, of openness. And that's a fairly long-lasting effect. And those who had a meditative practice, it reinforced that. It allowed that to go on longer. So they're not incompatible, but you can achieve spiritual advancement through meditation. You don't have to take psychedelics. That's one of the things.
Breath work as well.
And the other thing with respect to schizophrenia and so on, a comment, ayahuasquero I respect very much told me once that there are 2 kinds of people he would not treat. One was schizophrenics, because he felt that because of the risks, it just wasn't worth it. The other was sociopaths. He said he would not treat sociopaths because it won't help them. And I thought that was a very insightful thing. I think those of us in the psychedelic world probably know a lot of people who take lots of psychedelics, and they're still jerks. It does not necessarily cure personality disorders. It may even reinforce them, and sociopathy, it can reinforce them in the wrong circumstances. I think this is one of the risks of taking psychedelics in the retreat environment. You have to have confidence in the person who is holding the space. They may not have your best interests in mind, and there's no regulation of this. So you have to be able to trust the people that are giving you the medicine, because psychedelics are, powerful tools for essentially controlling people, controlling what they think, how they react. So you have to be confident that the people that are supervising your session are doing through out of compassion and love, and not a desire to manipulate you in some way.
Which is a whole nother realm.
A whole nother realm.
Whole nother realm. The practitioner providing you the medicine, set and setting, very important. It's the Mecca. Yeah. Any other quick questions before? Because we do value your tummy, so we want to make sure that you can go get some grub in you before the presentation starts.
Hi, I just want to touch on kind of gap between a psychedelic experience and the sobriety experience, and that the taking experiences learned or inspiration from psychedelic experiences can often be lost when transferring them back into everyday life, and also touching on the dangers of building a superficial self based on another substance and not actually yourself.
You're going to have to repeat the question.
Yeah, he was talking about...
it's a very echoey environment here, and I'm...
Yeah, it's all right. I think he said basically it was kind of this idea, kind of what I feel like...
Kind of why sociopaths shouldn't drink ayahuasca.
This idea that you are going to have some kind of a revelatory experience, be connected to all this stuff, but then how do you bring that into your sober existence? You know, does it wash away? And just in this superficiality of this psychonaut culture where they're just regularly hitting these peaks and then telling everybody I know what the peak is, but not really embodying that, you know? It's
I mean, you have to be open to the idea of changing. And you can take psychedelics, and if you have such a firewall already constructed that, you know, it won't affect you, that you have a preconception that it's not going to do you any good. It's a two-way street. I mean, all the medicine does is facilitate some element of self-discovery within yourself. But if you already have constructed your personality to be sure that you're not going to be exposed to that, I think the most powerful psychedelic in the world is not going to blast that open. You have to have that element of participation. You have to be able to surrender to it. You know, and when you take a psychedelic, you're very deliberately stepping out of your reference frame, if you want to put it that way, or your default mode network. You're stepping out of your usual reference frame for a reason. The reason is you can get a fresh perspective on your existential situation. And often the insights that come from that is where the therapeutic response lies. Wouldn't you agree? For example, addiction. Addiction is a learned behavior. It's a habitual behavior. And there are all sorts of things in one's life, in one's physiology, everything else that reinforces that addiction. Psychedelics can temporarily interrupt that. And from that insight, you can get insight into those behaviors and say, okay, this is what needs to be changed. You can come back with that clarity and start making those changes. Or you can say, well, I had this experience, and then you go back to exactly the way it was before. And a drug like ibogaine, for example, which can be used for opiate addiction very effectively. But if you don't participate actively in the therapeutic process, it's not going to work. The drug doesn't do it for you. You do it for yourself.
It's just a bridge.
Based on what you learn. Yeah, based on the insights.
Roman had a question, and then we're going to take a break. You can just yell it. Your voice is so beautiful.
Oh, come here.
Hi, my name is Roman, and I'm a psychonaut.
What a beautiful voice.
I can understand it.
Thank you, Uncle Dennis. My question is in regards to set and setting, but also the kind of emergence of ayahuasca and plant medicine in the Western world. And how do you feel about taking the sacred medicine out of its original space and, you know, the emergence of retreat centers in Europe and the United States, so not in the Amazon basin?
Yeah, I'll start. You know, it's happening, and it's happened. And so it's spread into the world, and it's growing in other parts of the world. They grow it in Hawaii, they grow it in Australia, they grow it anywhere it'll grow, they're going to grow it, you know? We don't chase down, like, apples. How come you shouldn't be able to grow apples over there? It's only for us. So there it is, you know, it's the nature growing in the earth. There is, just like what we were just talking about, it came up a little bit, like, and then I would use the example of the MDMA psychotherapy trial, where they're doing 12 weeks of therapy to work with these people to try to get somewhere and promote this kind of change that you're talking about. They're only doing the substance 2 or 3 times in that time frame. They have major experts that have really been developing their craft and their art to help provide the proper support to get to where they're getting, which is really making a huge difference in PTSD. Meanwhile, tons of people are doing MDMA at the festivals or anywhere, and they're not getting there, you know? So in my case, where I got to, you know, be in the Amazon and see really advanced masters working with ayahuasca, they're getting places and they're able to do things with that medicine with people that somebody who's not experienced that way, they can't even imagine. So there is a deeper experience. There is room for novel exploration, and there's going to be new forms, you know. When yoga came to the United States, some people weren't happy about that. You know, when Chinese medicine came to the United States, some people weren't happy about that. They said Bruce Lee was teaching Kung Fu and they came over looking for him, you know, to scold him. And so traditions are moving around the world. So it's just recognizing and acknowledging that experience teaches wisdom. And so to think that you're just going to figure it out because you're a psychonaut that is just, you've seen it all and done it all, that you're going to be able to do what some person that has done for their entire life, learning from generations upon generations. You know, here we are in this building, like I say all the time. It's like this architecture knowledge to build this building was not developed in one lifespan, you know, period. Classical music was not developed within one lifespan. Multi-generational knowledge is a very, very powerful reality. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that in whatever tradition we're drawing from, whether that's Western medicine here at the Mayo Clinic, you know, building on decades and centuries of knowledge, it's more powerful. You know, I'm a doctor. When you, like I say to people, when you come out, you know, we got all these people with the weekend, they're shamans and blah, blah, blah. If I come out, if I go to the Mayo Clinic in medical school and residency, and I went to the Mayo Clinic, but if I'm like the fresh one, if I come out and you just found that I just got out, you're not going to be that excited that I'm your doctor. And that's like 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. So there's a lot more to it. You know, that's what I want people to remember. And it's true in the psychedelic world and the plant medicine world and the therapeutic world. You can go a lot further, but it takes discipline, it takes study, it takes humility, it takes respect.
And that is why we shouldn't read so deep when Chelsea Handler goes to the jungle and comes back with a poor experience. It's been bastardized. Now kids are going to festivals with DMT vape pens. There's an ultimate disrespect going on, but it doesn't mean that there isn't respect that's still existing.
Right. It's a very complex subject that you've raised, and it's multifaceted. You know, and I think it's important to realize that spiritual traditions have always been commodified, and there are always opportunities to see opportunists who see the chance for power or prestige or whatever by getting into these traditions, and certainly that doesn't exemplify the respect that plant medicines deserve. I'm a biologist. I look at this in some ways from the 30,000-foot level. We're in a coevolutionary process with these plant medicines. We have been ever since we discovered them, which has been some multiple centuries ago. We're at a rough spot right now because the plants are going global. It's not necessarily we that are doing it. I often like to say, don't forget the plants are running things. And what do plants want to do? They want to spread, they want to grow, they want to form symbioses with our species. It's to their advantage to do that. And so, you know, plants have been, as Michael Pollan has often said cleverly of other plants, for example, corn. You know, we think we cultivate corn, maybe corn cultivates us. And I think in some ways these plant medicines are, you know, we're serving their purpose, which is ultimately benign. You know, I don't think you can say that these plant medicines are or should be the exclusive purview of indigenous people. You know, the world needs them. And, you know, in a sense, something like ayahuasca is the common heritage of mankind, of humankind. The indigenous people have been the stewards of this knowledge, and we should respect that, and we should try and keep those traditions in mind, and the way that they have respectfully approached this as we, the global culture, proceeds to co-opt this, and it's inevitable, it's going to happen. And it's in part, you know, if we had vibrant spiritual traditions within our own culture, we wouldn't need to go to the Amazon to have these experiences. You know, it's because we are so spiritually bereft as a culture. People are looking for answers, you know, outside their comfort zones, their normal reference frames. I think it's not unfair to say it may provoke some people, but I think that religion has largely failed in a certain way. It's become a hollowed out. You know, the last thing a religion wants you to do is have a mystical experience. You know, I mean, that is not encouraged, because, you know, there's the hierarchy and all that. So yeah, it's very complex, and we don't know the answers, but what we do know is that we're in this coevolutionary relationship, which is these plants are not going to go away, obviously. So we have to learn from indigenous people, learn that wisdom, but we can't ape them. You know, we can't become indigenous people. We're not indigenous people, except that everyone is indigenous to Earth. You know, but we can respect the way they approach it and try to develop essentially new paradigms that work for 21st century.
And what we can do is respect them as human beings. And now in today's world, there is more dialogue. So rather than everybody, all of us up here saying, well, I think the Indians think this, I think the indigenous people think this, is have Amazonians at the table, you know, talking about this, and that's happening.
Right.
So the World Ayahuasca Conference had a number of Amazonian, maybe not enough, but they brought them all the way to Spain, and so these voices were being heard. You know, my teacher Ricardo was there, and he's Amazonian, he's a real Shipibo, he's a real native. He's opening his doors to the culture. He's saying these people need it. Like, you know, he's saying this culture has become so spiritually bereft. And he's like, okay, let these people, and some of them say, well, if we don't help them, they're going to destroy the world. You know, and they're saying the ayahuasca is saying that, the Amazonians are saying that. That's the premise of the movie Embrace of the Serpent.
Right.
That this guy, this Colombian shaman is so angry and resentful to the European, you know, influence that destroyed his world and his family and his life. But then at the end of the movie, he realizes, I have to teach them. I have to teach them, you know? And that's kind of where we are right now. And that's actually been prophesized. That's the eagle and the condor.
Yeah.
You know, that has been prophesized. That from Incan, whatever, mysticism, etc., that is what's happening right now. That there were going to be this period of big destruction and alienation and over-intellectualization and over-industrialization that would lead to the decimation of these native peoples of the Americas and in other parts of the world. And that eventually this European diaspora would start realizing the error of their ways. It's not working out. This approach is not working out. And they're going to start reaching out for help from the native people. And the native people who are still grieving their losses and are still angry and still, you know, overcoming a Holocaust and deciding whether or not they want to share. And they're looking at their world saying, you know what, maybe I'm going to share. Maybe I want to participate in this. So that's what's happening right now. And I think as long as the voices are being heard on both sides, we can proceed with respect.
Ooga chaka, ooga, ooga, ooga chaka, ooga, ooga, ooga chaka.